My name is Diogenes Brito, and I'm a staff product designer at Slack and the lead designer on the Workflow Builder. Brad Harris will be joining us later on to talk to you through the technical experience of building a step. Let's begin with introducing the Workflow Builder. If you know Slack, you know that Slack is a channel-based messaging platform that replaces email inside your company. Channels provide you and your team a shared view into what work is being done, so everyone in the channel has access to the same information. And when new team members join, it's much simpler to catch up on the context they need to start working. That means that work and processes naturally end up flowing into Slack channels. So automating some of that work in Slack is the next logical step. That's why we created Workflow Builder. With Workflow Builder, you create workflows which automate routine tasks, all without writing any code. Workflows are simply a trigger followed by a series of steps. Triggers, shown on the left here, start the workflow. They are events like a person joining a channel, reacting to a message with an emoji, or clicking on a shortcut in the shortcut menu. You can also set up triggers that are based on the time of day or events from other web services via a webhook. Once a workflow has been triggered, you can run one or more steps like sending a message or collecting information via form. So you can use Workflow Builder to onboard new employees, run a daily stand-up, or collect information after a customer phone call. The workflow on screen, for example, starts when someone clicks the Request a Review shortcut. It collects information and then posts a message to the Design Reviews channel with the information that was collected. Shifting to using channels as a way to keep people informed and coordinated can transform how you work all by itself. But anyone can make Slack even more powerful by building workflows to automate and structure their team's processes. With steps from apps, workflows are even better. You can do much more than send a message or create a form. Now, apps can add to the step library, so builders can get steps from the Slack app directory or develop completely new ones to add to their custom Slack apps. These new steps from apps can be used to connect external tools and services and add new functionality to Workflow Builder. So this workflow I showed you before could go from this to this. Instead of sending the request for review to a channel, you could send it to your internal task management system. Steps from apps, like Slack's own native steps, can show configuration options and use variable data from previous steps. So let's talk about what you will want to consider when designing a Workflow Builder step for your app. First, think about whether your step will need to authenticate a user account in a third-party service or system. If it does, start there. Configuring your step will start by authenticating an account and then returning to the builder. When a step is performing an action on behalf of a linked account, make sure it's clear which account is connected, and give workflow builders a way to remove the authentication and choose another account to use instead. Finally, optimize for flexibility. Users should be able to leverage all of Workflow Builder's features, combining other steps from apps and built-in steps from Slack in their workflows. Let's talk about how you might do that. When thinking about which steps to provide, consider unbundling individual actions that are part of your core user flows. For example, creating, reading, and updating records in your system is a good place to start, like these Google Sheet steps you see on the right. Making these individual actions available as separate steps lets workflow builders combine them together in complex and useful ways you wouldn't even expect. That's why you should also make available separately what builders might want to do separately. They may want to do just one part of a flow or perform certain actions more than once before continuing. For example, the standard lunch train app user flow involves creating a lunch train that is posted to a channel. By providing a separate share a lunch train order step, a workflow builder could say, choose to share an email instead of inside Slack, or share it multiple places using the share step multiple times. I mentioned sharing to Slack as part of a step, but if you can, make that optional and try to rely on the built-in steps from Slack to send messages or create forms. This will allow workflow builders to customize the Slack messages they send and how they collect data. It's also good practice to enable variable data from previous steps in the configuration of your step whenever possible. This one is easy because some of the BlockKit blocks that you'll be using to render your configuration interface automatically handle this for you. Just like your step should be able to take variables as input, it should also be able to provide useful variables as output. For example, this create a task step could output the URL of the task created. That could be used in a send a message step later on to link directly to the task. Speaking of outputting variable data, sometimes making a step that provides a useful variable is incredibly handy, like outputting just the right user or channel for use in a send a message step. The step on the right here is an example. It picks a random member from a channel and returns it as a variable for use in the workflow. Brad's going to show you how to build exactly this step and how it could be useful.
All right, well, let's go ahead and build a step together. And I think the best way to get started with that will be to look at how we can use that workflow step in a real workflow. Let's take a look at a workflow that IT team has set up to help field their help requests. So in this particular workspace, this IT team has two channels. They have a help channel and they have a team IT channel. The help channel they've set up so that other employees in the company can come and request help from them. And then their team channel is where they go to triage those requests, discuss them, and work on them. So they've set up a workflow that can be launched by anyone in the company that can come in and click request help, and they can share what it is they're having a problem with. So let's simulate a help request and say, I'm having problems logging into the ticketing system. So that gets submitted. The user gets some feedback that their request was submitted. And then over in the Team IT channel, there's another message that mentions the channel so that everyone's aware of it, and then shares the details of that request along with who it was that requested it. So this workflow works pretty well. It's pretty simple. But this team might not want to notify the entire channel every time a help request comes in. So what we can do is we can use a custom step from an app in our workflow to pick a random member of the channel that we'll assign that request to. So let's jump into the workflow in Workflow Builder. And this is what we have so far. It starts with that shortcut that someone can click to request help, collect some information with a form. It sends a message to let them know that their request has been submitted. And then it notifies the Teams channel to let them know the details. And you can see it mentions the channel here, which is going to notify everybody. So what we'll do is we'll add a step right before it, and we'll pick our select a random channel member step. We'll add that. And then we'll pick the channel that we want to use as where we select a random member from. So we'll pick the Team IT channel and save that. And then we'll open this step up because we want to replace this channel mention with that random member. We can see it's available right here. So we'll select that, and then we'll save it and publish it. Now let's go run it again. All right, we'll come back to our help channel. We'll submit another request. The ticketing system is still giving me problems. So they submit that, and then over in their team channel, instead of mentioning the whole channel, it picked a random member of that team. So this is a simple example of how you could use a step from an app to change the behavior to be exactly what you want for your team. So now that we've got that a good picture of what it is we're trying to build, let's jump into an app and see how we would actually build that. So over here, I've created a Slack app already. It's just a bare bones app. It's all, it has a name and an icon, and that's about it. So if you want to add a workflow step to your app, the first thing you have to do is go to the workflow steps page. And we'll go ahead and enable it. And then you can add up to 10 steps for in your app. So we'll add one and we'll call it select a random channel member. And the name is used inside of Workflow Builder to let workflow authors find your step as they search to find a step that does what they want. And the callback ID is a lot like our other callback IDs, where you'll receive this as part of your action payload so that you can determine which specific step is being added. So we'll call this one random member. It can be anything you want. It just needs to be unique across the steps that are in your app. All right, so we've got our step added. Now we just need to add and enable event subscriptions and our interactivity. So let's jump into event subscriptions. We'll turn this on and we'll enter our URL. And I'm using ngrok locally so that I can get events submitted from Slack. If we open up our bot events here, we'll see we're automatically subscribed to this workflow step execute event. We should be good there. We'll save that. We'll jump back to our workflow steps. And we'll see now we just need to enable interactivity. We'll turn that on and we'll plug in our URL for that and save it. All right, the last thing that we need to do, and this will be dependent on what it is you're trying to accomplish in your app, but you may need to add some additional scopes. You'll see that there's a workflow steps execute scope that's automatically added, and that's required for your step for your app to have workflow steps. In this case, I'm going to be trying to select a random member of a channel. So I'll need to be able to call the conversations.members endpoint, and that requires an additional bot token scope. So I'm going to select the channels read and add that scope. So you can add any scopes that you need depending on what API calls you need to make and what functionality you need. The last thing we'll need to do is reinstall our app. And now it'll have those new scopes. All right, now we should be good to go. So we've got our app all set up. Now let's jump into our actual project and take a look at what kind of code we need to write to start enabling this new step that we've created. All right, well, this is where you have a choice. Up here, I've got the GitHub, a URL to a GitHub repo that we'll be using in this demo. Feel free to check it out if you haven't already. And if you'd like to follow along, I've got two different ways you could do that. One, if you just want to code along with us as we're doing this, you can check out the demo frontiers start branch. If you'd rather just get the end solution, which is where we'll end up at the end of this demo, you can check out the demo frontiers end branch and then follow along. So whichever style you prefer, or you could just watch and follow along. So I'm going to go ahead and check out the demo frontiers start, because this will be a pretty boring demo if the code was already written. We will restart a few things. This is a TypeScript project. It's a Node.js application, and I'm using Bolt for JavaScript. And this particular repository has a README file that has some instructions on what you'll need to do to start it, but it should be a pretty typical Node application. You'll need some environment variables set up within a .env file that has your bot token, signing secret, and your verification token. You can get those all from your app configuration screens. You need to install dependencies with npm install. And then the last two things, I run the TypeScript compiler in a watch mode. And then I also run nodemon in a watch mode to restart my node process as the TypeScript compiler outputs changes. So With that set up, it makes development a little bit smoother so that things will just restart as we make changes. So we should be good there. Let's jump in. At the top level, we've got a server file that sets up our Bolt app and then just starts it up on the defined port. And then inside of our app, we've got a very simple Bolt app that's set up. And we give it our token and signing secret, but there's really nothing that is doing right now other than spinning up and connecting with the right credentials. So let's start adding what we need for our workflow step. I like to create a new folder for each of the steps that I add to my app. So we'll go ahead and do that. And we'll call it random member step, since that's what the step does. We will add an index file to it. And we will export a function to configure our step. So we'll call it configure random member step. And we'll give it the Bolt app. And we won't return anything in this function. Now, if you've written a Bolt app before, you've probably done things like this, where you set up event listeners for different events that come in, maybe handled some actions, possibly a view submission. Now, Workflow Step is really a combination of all of those things because of the different lifecycle events in a workflow step. So to make this a little bit easier, Bolt provides a pretty handy class that we can use. So we're going to create our step, and you do that with creating a workflow step class. We create an instance of that. And the first argument you have to give to it is the callback ID that we used when we added the step to our app. And if you remember, that was random member. And then the second argument is a configuration object. And it represents three different lifecycle hooks of a workflow step. The first one is when a user adds or edits a step. The second one is when a user saves a step. And the third one is when a step runs. So this first one, when the user adds or edits their step, there's an edit property that we set, and we can set that to an array, which will allow us to provide a series of middleware functions, and these are Bolt middleware functions that we want to run during an add or edit of a step. The second one is save, and it's also an array. And the last one is execute, which is also an array. All right, the final thing that we have to do is we have to register our step with Bolt. And we can do that with this calling the step function on Bolt and passing it our step instance that we created up here. So we'll save that. All right, that gives us kind of some bare bones that we need for the outline of our step. But let's start plugging it. As it is right now, it's not going to do anything because we haven't implemented any of these middleware functions. So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll start with edit. So each of these are Bolt middleware functions, and they're asynchronous, and they receive an object that has a few different properties. We get an ACK function that lets us acknowledge the action that we received. We get a step object that represents the workflow step, and we get a configure function, which is really a helper function around views.open, if you're familiar with that. But it sets up some of the properties that we need to open our workflow step view. All right, so the first thing we'll do is we'll acknowledge our request or our action, and we're going to just log out the step. Say edit step. And then we can call configure. At a minimum, we need to call configure with some blocks defined. So what we'll do is we will use a section block and have a short description of what it is that our step does. And that'll help communicate to the user what they can expect out of this step. Now I've got a few things wrong with my TypeScript types, so I'm going to need to add some TypeScript ignore comments. So that should give us a real bare bones handler for our edit and our add step events. The next thing we want to do is we want to jump into our save and handle this. This will look a lot like a view submission, but there's one additional task that we have to perform inside of there. So this is an async function as well. It gets an ACK callback. It receives the step object. It also receives the view like a view submission. And then the last thing it receives is an update function that we can call to update our step. So we will go ahead and acknowledge the action. Let's go ahead and log out our step. And then let's also log the view's value. So if you're familiar with a view submission, it has a state property that will contain a values object. And that will have any values inside of our inputs from our view, which we don't have any yet, but we'll get back to that. So we'll log those, and then we'll just go ahead and call update without setting anything. And I'm gonna fix those warnings from TypeScript. All right, let's pause right there and let's jump back into Workflow Builder and take a look and see what it is we've accomplished. So we'll jump into Workflow Builder. I'm gonna go ahead and basically undo the changes we made to this workflow when we changed it from mentioning the channel. And then we'll rebuild that. So the first thing we want to do is add our step. So we'll select that. Now if we look over here, it looks like our event was not acknowledged. So let's jump in and check out what it is that we have wrong there. So we wrote all this code, but we're not actually running it yet. So let's jump up here to where we configure our Bolt app and actually register our step. Call configure random member step, pass it our app, and save that. Now we can just click retry here, and it'll send that event to us again. Now we see we've got our description. Not particularly useful quite yet, but we're getting there. Let's save it and see what happens. All right, so let's look over here in the console. We've got two entries. We've got our edit step payload, and we've got our save step payload. On the edit step, we'll notice there's a workflow ID and a step ID. The workflow ID represents the unique workflow that the user is authoring. And the step ID represents the unique instance of your step inside of that workflow. So you may have, the user might decide to use multiple steps from your app inside their workflow. And in that case, those would share the same workflow ID, but each step would have their own unique step ID. We can see our inputs and our outputs are both represented by an empty object and an empty array, respectively. And that's because we haven't saved anything on them yet. If we look at our save step payload, we have that same workflow ID, same step ID, but in addition, we have a workflow step edit ID. Now, this is a lot like a trigger ID. And because we're using that workflow step class right here, it's handling how we have to automatically use this when we go ahead and configure our step and open that view. So if you're not using Bolt, you'll need to be aware of this, and it's a parameter that you have to pass into views.open. All right, well, let's go ahead and add some inputs to our step. Let's take a look at what we have. And what we want here is we want a channel select so that the user can pick the channel that they want to pick a random person from. So we will jump back into here and we'll use an input block. And this will have a channel select along with a label and a hint to give them an idea of what this is for and how it'll be used. So that'll give us an input, but that alone won't be everything that we need. What we want to actually do is in our view submission or our save middleware function, we want to grab the value of that input. So we can do that. Let's say it's going to be a channel ID, and it's going to be on the view.state.values. And then to reference your input, you need to use the block ID, and that can be whatever you gave it up there, followed by the action ID of the element. And then because this is a channel select, it's going to be selected channel, I believe. All right. So that'll give us the channel ID, but we need to actually save that in our step configuration. So let's talk about step configuration for just a minute. An important aspect of workflow steps is they're treated as sort of these black boxes where they can define the inputs that they need when they run. And they do that during this configure flow for the edit and save callbacks. And then when they run, they also can provide some outputs so that those can be used by subsequent steps in the workflow. So this save handler is where we have the opportunity to define and create what those inputs are going to be and what outputs we'll produce with them. So to do that in our update call, we can provide some inputs. Now, inputs is a key value object where the keys can be anything you want them to be. So in this case, I'll just call it channel ID. And then the value of each of those keys needs to be an object with, at a minimum, a value property. So in this case, I just want to use the actual channel ID that was selected. So I'll just set it to channel ID as well there. So we'll save that. And let's jump back to our step and try it out. Let's close that. So we'll reopen it. All right, we see we have our select a channel input now. I'm going to go ahead and pick our Team IT channel and save that. And if we look over in the console here, we'll see our save step. We got that same payload for our workflow step. And then we got our view submission values here where we had our selected channel. So if we open this back up and then jump over here to the console, we still get our workflow ID and step ID, but in addition, we now have this channel ID set on our inputs. But if you paid attention, you probably noticed that that channel is not preset as the default value here. So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll do that back up here in our edit handler. And we're going to pull that off of our step configuration. So, and this is where it's important to remember that the first time when someone's adding their step, that configuration will be empty. So in this case, we want to make sure that we account for the fact that it might not be set yet. And it's going to be channel ID dot value. Otherwise, we'll set it to undefined to handle that case where channel ID has not been set yet because it's a new step. And then we'll jump down to our channel select element, and we will set the initial channel property to that channel ID. We'll save that and jump back. And then let's just close this and reopen it. And now it's got our channels pre-selected there. So if you noticed, along with static channels that a user could pick, they also have these workflow variable channels available to them. So any previous steps or the trigger that output a channel will be available for the workflow builder to pick inside of their inputs. Now, as a developer, you didn't have to do anything to enable this, but let's take a look and see what it looks like when someone picks that. So I'll select that, the channel where the workflow started. We'll save it. And let's jump over to our console. And if we look at our view submission values here, and we look at the selected channel, instead of being a static channel ID, like we saw up here, it's now this templatized reference to a workflow variable. So as a developer, you don't really have to do anything special or treat this in any different way than you would a static channel, other than make sure you save that as you would a channel ID and use it in the same way. during this edit and save flow. And then when your workflow runs, we'll see how that value is actually given to us, but it'll be replaced with the actual value for that instance of the workflow when it's run. So I'm going to go ahead and change this back to my Team IT channel because that's what I want here. And we'll save that. We'll publish that. And that wraps up our authoring portion of our step. So the last thing that we need to do is make our step actually do something when it runs. So we've got our edit complete here. We've got our saving our channel ID. The last thing we want to do is we want to jump into our execute middleware and add one. So we'll go ahead and add one. It's going to look a lot like these previous ones. In this case, this is an event, and Bolt will auto acknowledge events that come in. So we don't need to worry about an ACK callback here, but we'll receive our step and we'll receive a function called complete that we'll call when we want to complete our step. All right, so let's go ahead and log our step. Let's say execute step. Now, what we want to do is we want to plug off, or we want to grab that channel ID that we've saved as a step input, because that's what we're going to need to make our call to conversations.members to get a list of the members of the selected channel. So we'll do that. It'll look a lot like it did up here in our edit function, but it will be step.inputs, channel ID, value. Now, if we don't have a channel ID for some reason, we really can't do anything in our step. We can't make our call. We don't know what channel to look for those members inside of. So we'll just go ahead and log no channel provided. And we could just return. But by doing that, we're not indicating that there was a problem with this step at all. So one thing to be aware of with workflow steps is they can take as little or as much time as you need. That could be milliseconds, it could be days, it could be months. So it really depends on what it is the step is doing and how long it needs to complete that. So if we just returned here, we would never complete this step. And when a workflow builder went to look at their workflow and look at the activity log, it would just look like this step. The workflow is just hung on this step. But in reality, we will never be able to complete this step, and it's in an error state because there's no channel ID. So what we want to do is we want to fail the step. So there's also a fail callback that we can use. And you can use that when you know that there's something wrong with this step. And you provide an object with an error property that has an object with a message property. And we'll just use the same message here. And maybe we'll make it a little bit more readable for humans. There was no channel provided. Now, the reason you might want to make this a little bit more descriptive is this is the message that will be presented to the workflow builder when your step runs and it fails. So you should use this as an opportunity to communicate what kind of problem there was with it and potentially anything that the builder could do to fix it. All right. So once we're past that, we have our channel ID. We want to grab the members of the provided channel. So we will use the client that's on the Bolt app, and it's going to be the conversations.members call. And you need a token, which is a bot token, and then you need a channel, which in this case will be our channel ID. Now, one handy thing that Bolt does is it provides this context object that it will automatically populate with things like your bot token. All right, we're going to add these same tsignore comments. So let's grab the result of that call. We'll await it. And then it returns us an array of member IDs. So And I'm going to need to type this here. And then I'll also need to cast it here. And then through the power of math, we'll go ahead and pick a random member of that channel. Now, I can never remember that combination, so I have to look it up every time. The last thing that we need to do here is complete our step. So we'll use this complete call. And then this is where we get to provide those outputs that we said we would provide. But we haven't actually defined any yet, so let's just leave that empty. And let's jump back to our workflow and take a look and see what are the outputs that we would want to provide. So remember, our goal here was to have this step, our last message step. We wanted to be able to remove this and then replace it with a variable, but it's not available here yet. And that's because we haven't defined it. So let's jump over into our save call, and we're providing our inputs. So let's add an output. And this is an array of objects where each of them defines an output. And they require a name, which is just a unique string, unique to this step. We'll call it random member, a type, which in this case is a user, but it could also be a channel, which would expect a channel ID as the value, or it could just be text. So we'll leave this as a user. And then the last thing you have to provide is a label. And that's how it'll be surfaced inside of Workflow Builder, so that users using your step know what this output is and have some context about it. So we'll just say random user as our label. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and just comment that out for now. And then let's jump back in. So we'll open our step up. We won't make any changes, but we'll just save it so that it gets saved with those new outputs. Now, if we jump into our message step here and we look at the insert variable, we can see that random user output is available to us. So let's go ahead and update our message so that we're using that. All right, let's save and publish that, and then jump back into our code. So we'll bring this back, and then let's go ahead and look at what we need to do to provide that output. So when we call complete, we can provide the outputs, which in this case is going to be an object where the keys map to the names that you provided up here. So in this case, I said I'd provide this random member output, and I'll go ahead and set it to this random channel member that we grabbed from our results of our API call. So we'll save that. So we should be good. We've got our workflow here. We've got our execute call all wired up. So let's give it a shot and see how it works. So we'll jump back to our help channel, and we'll go ahead and hit our shortcut, request help. Still having a lot of problems with that ticketing system. All right, so they got their message here. And if we jump over to the Team IT channel, we see that instead of at mentioning the whole channel, it mentioned a single person. So let's go ahead and run it one more time just to make sure it's doing what we think it's doing. If we jump back here, we see it picked a different person. So that's it. Let's we've got our step running, and that's all it takes. Now, one of the powerful things about steps is that as other apps add steps to their apps, users will be able to use those in ways that you might not think of, and they can compose their workflows of all these different steps without those steps having to be aware of each other. So for example, a user could come in here, they could add another step at the end, and they could pick the add a row to a Google Sheet step. And they could create a really low friction, simple audit log of all the help requests come in, and maybe log who it was that made the request, what their details were, and who we assigned to it. And then they can write that to a spreadsheet and then use that to track what's happening. And maybe as they do that, they see that randomly assigning a person is not creating a very balanced way to assign the work. So they could come back and change that step to be a little bit more intelligent. All right. Well, that was a lot. We went through what do you need to do to add the configuration to your app, and then how you can create that with Bolt for JavaScript. But I wanted to leave you with a few little pieces of information so that you know where to go to learn more. One of the places you can go is slack.com/apps/collections/workflows. And there you can see which Slack apps are providing workflow steps. And that'll help give you an idea of what apps are providing, and maybe provide some inspiration about what kinds of steps you might want to provide in your apps. There's also a link to the GitHub repo that we used as part of this demo. And we'll be continuing to add more sample steps to that repo as time goes on. I mentioned we used Bolt for JS, so slack.dev/Bolt has great documentation on Bolt, where you can learn a little bit more about that there. And finally, we've got some API documentation on workflow steps, specifically at api.slack.com/workflows/steps. I wanted to thank you for your time. I hope it was helpful. I hope you learned a little bit more about workflow steps, and maybe even had some ideas about what kinds of steps you'll add to your apps. And we're excited to see what steps everyone builds to connect their apps and integrations to automated workflows.